Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the National 911 Program. My name is Pat and I will be the moderator for today's session. Designed to provide useful information about federal and state participation in the planning, design, and implementation of Next Generation 911, coupled with real experiences from leaders overseeing these transitions throughout the country. Our session today features two presenters, Mr. Christopher Carver, NENA's Director of PSAP Operations, and Mr. Mark Fletcher, ENP Chief Architect of Public Safety Telecommunications Solutions. Today's webinar focuses on increasing awareness of swatting incidents for the 911 community and discusses steps towards preparedness and response. After the presentations, the speakers will be available for question and answer. For more information on future National 911 Program webinars or to access archived recordings or learn more about the National 911 Program, please visit 911.gov. Feedback or question about the webinars can be sent to national911team@mcp911.com. If you are experiencing difficulty with the WebEx application, please call WebEx Technical Assistance at 866-229-3239 and select option 1. Please note that all participants' phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode and this webinar is being recorded. To ask questions of our presenters, feel free to take one of two actions. Using WebEx's chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, enter your question at any time during the presentation and it will be entered into the queue. Or to ask your question live, use the raise hand feature to request your phone line to be unmuted and you will be called upon to ask your question. With that, I would like to introduce Ms. Lori Flaherty, Coordinator of the National 911 Program. Lori, please go ahead.
Thanks, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone. As many of you know, the 911 community has been grappling with a recent surge of swatting incidents. In the state of New Jersey alone, we've heard that there have been 36 false reports, resulting in a substantial misuse of time, money, and resources. The National Emergency Number Association, NENA, and the National 911 Program recognize the need to provide PSAPs and emergency responders with information on addressing swatting incidents. And we've recently released a joint guidance document which is available at both 911.gov and nena.org. I'm very pleased today to introduce two great people who are well known to many of us as our presenters today. Our first presenter is Christopher Carver, NENA's Director of PSAP Operations. Christopher recently joined NENA from FDNY, the Fire Department of New York City, where he rose to the rank of Director of Fire Dispatch Operations. In his nearly 15-year tenure, he worked during many large-scale incidents, including Superstorm Sandy and the blizzard of December of 2010. Mr. Carver will be followed by Mark Fletcher, Chief Architect for Public Safety Solutions. Many of you know him as Fletch. Mark has been, frankly, a passionate advocate for 911 and telecommunications systems for many years on so many issues. You may know him from his podcast series or his advocacy for multi-line telephone systems and Kerry's Law, but Mark has provided countless hours of technical assistance for many organizations, including ours, the FCC, NENA, and ENA, and we're really lucky to have both of them with us today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris to get us started. Chris, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Lori, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank all of you that are taking time out of your very busy days and schedules to participate in truly what is a very important discussion, but even more than that, an important example of the kinds of ways that we can come together as a 911 industry and as a 911 community and address the challenges that 911 centers face across the United States. Even to this day, unfortunately, we still have many agencies that sometimes think they're alone, that sometimes don't leverage the talents and knowledge and abilities of their fellow 911 professionals to ensure that we find the best solutions that are out there and gain the best information for the challenges that we face. So I'd like to also take a moment and thank Lori and her organization, supported by Mission Critical Partners, for joining with us here at NENA and Mark at Avaya to come together and do the kind of things that we should be doing as an industry even more often, which is sharing our experiences and sharing what we know to help address the challenges that we face. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and go on to my first slide. So what do we define swatting as being? Basically, for an operational purpose, the deliberate reporting of a serious event, normally they're police-related or law enforcement-related, and the reporting of that event is intended to cause embarrassment and potentially harm for another person. The most recent rise to popularity of these types of events have occurred within the context of the gaming community. As many of you are probably aware, the impetus for this started a few years ago by gamers, or those playing video games remotely with other game players linked, by a gaming system, thinking that it would be cool and or funny and or whatever to call in false alarms of potentially serious matters to try and impact the other players within that game. This was highlighted by the fact that for the first time, because of technology, they were able to watch the results of that prank happen literally before them, and then share that either instantly or later on through social media with others. The other thing that makes it very unique is the sense of swatting involving calls being placed from sometimes great geographic distances or even other countries. You might be playing a game online with somebody from Canada or somebody from New Mexico or somebody from another part of the United States, and you be sitting perfectly still in Ohio. So that necessitated the second component. So the social media component is important. The secondary component that makes this a little bit different is the fact that these reports are coming sometimes from so far away. So that required for the gamers the ability to be able to make that call. So for that reason, they developed the use of some systems that we'll talk about later on, and Mark specifically, so that they could mask where they were calling from or acquire access into the 911 system of the jurisdiction where the person was they were actually pulling the prank on. So go on to that next slide for me, please. But one of the things that, and I really think that this is critical for everyone to understand, especially those who may not have been exposed too much to 911 operations, is that swatting or malicious false alarms is not really a new invention. On the slide there you'll see those are just the selected malicious false alarm reports from the New York City Fire Department, comparing their recent high in 1995, which is around 100,000, to a more recent number around 20,000. Now those occur in a variety of ways, but many of them are intentional responses generated by individuals to the fire department for whatever nefarious purpose they wanted to. Sometimes it was kids who just wanted to see a fire truck respond down the street. Sometimes it was a type of swatting where somebody wanted to prank somebody else by reporting their house was on fire. So as you can see, just looking at New York alone, with 20,000 a year, that's a tremendous number. So this is something that we have seen before, but also contained in that graph is an even more important insight, which is that there are possible solutions. And there are ways to lessen the impact of this, and there are ways to ensure that the public is aware of the results and the consequences, and that we take some steps to not necessarily eradicate the problem. I don't know if that's ever going to be possible, in all honesty, but at least to reduce its frequency. And as another example of just how prevalent this has been, the next slide will introduce you to some folks that you might recognize. This has been around for so long that even Ponch and John had to deal with this in a first season episode of Chips. The episode itself aired in 1978. But it dealt with a 23-year-old gentleman who, impacted negatively by the loss of his father, who was a firefighter in the line of duty, resorted to calling in false alarms from highway call boxes. And it wasn't just false alarms. It was much more like swatting, because he didn't just report an auto accident. He would report an auto accident with a bus involved and a tanker and, dozens of injuries and massive fires and things like that. So this, again, has been around for a while, but it's not something that's impossible to deal with. It's also not something that is entirely, sadly, it's not that uncommon. But again, as with New York City's numbers and the way that they've impacted them in a positive way, therein lies some of the clues on how we can effectively manage this particular threat to the nation's 911 system. We go on to the next slide, please. Why is it different now, though? Just to summarize, it's the technology involved. That's one of the reasons why, not only from the social media part of being able to share these events, so folks not only get an instantaneous gratification out of doing it, but they actually get the social media benefit of it. The severity of what they're reporting in many cases is much different, and also the changing nature of police department responses contributes to that. Police departments much more concerned today about homeland security and other impacts of potentially violent events, such as the unfortunate mass shootings that we've all seen, tend to generate a much larger response than maybe they would have in years past. Hence the term SWATting, related to the SWAT team that would respond to certain types of large-scale violent events. And then climate and culture, where you now have, because of the influence of the social media component, the idea that folks are enjoying seeing that type of response. So it becomes a gratification element for them at various levels, including from the simple disrupting the game that somebody is playing up to larger scale social needs or social conditions resulting from somebody getting to see the impact of them making this false call. That all leads to a level of dangerousness to these types of events that really makes them incredibly serious, and something that we need to come together as a 911 community and address. For those of you that work in 911 centers, the concern about generating a large-scale response to a false. So, what can 911 centers actually do, recognizing that this is a critical problem? We have to deal with two elements to this. First and foremost, many times folks will anticipate or expect that 911 centers can just not respond, that somehow they'll have awareness that there is a critical issue, or a false alarm being reported, and somehow not be able to generate a response. That expectation is unrealistic for many, many reasons. Sadly, there have been numerous calls to 911 over the decades that 911 has been in existence, where dispatchers did exactly that. They assumed that a call was false, and it proved out that it actually was not. For liability and litigation reasons, and just simply because of the nature of the public need for 911 service to be delivered effectively, we want to discourage, if at all possible, 911 centers from getting into a scenario where they assume at the call that it is false and thereby don't send anybody to investigate it. That having been said, though, there are strategies that can be used to lessen the danger from swatting type events, and these are inherent in the nature of the way that some of these are often reported. First and foremost, the swatting events tend to be something that's very dramatic, very large scale, reported with only one call. 911 professionals who have been under the headset for any number of years realize quite quickly that the vast majority of major incidents are going to receive more than one phone call, sometimes many, many dozens more than one phone call. Next, that call is likely going to come in a very non-conventional way. Because of where the call is coming from, likely from another geographic location, it may come in on an administrative line, it may be masked, and Mark is actually going to talk about some of the technical sides of how those calls actually appear. But in the end, generally, they're not going to look like something that you've seen before. Now, it is also possible that your particular agency may have a gamer that's been the subject of a few of these. So hopefully the information has been entered that this has happened before. That's always a vital clue as well. But taken together, these, along with the intuition and training that many 911 professionals have regarding how to take a call, listening for the background clues, paying attention to the information, the tone of voice, and things like that, contribute to an environment where, in all likelihood, the incident will still be dispatched to responders. However, it's absolutely acceptable for the dispatcher to share with those responders some of those additional information elements that might lead to the need for those responders to be aware that this might be a swatting incident. Now, of course, be guided by your local agency's policies and your local agency's procedures regarding how you would specifically relay that information to the responder. But nonetheless, all those components coming together are valuable clues that this may not be a legitimate incident and may in fact fall into the realm of being swatting. Therefore, responders should be alerted to that, just as they should be of any other information related to any other event that might change the response or might necessitate them to take action or to respond in maybe a different way to ensure their safety. We would do the same thing if we had calls for a fire with people trapped, or we had a call for a domestic violence case where we knew that somebody had a weapon. It's the exact same thing here, sharing with them the information that's available to highlight the fact that this potentially could be a swatting type event is critical. If I could have the next slide, please. So, what are some other things that PSAPs can do to help mitigate or at least lessen the impact of these types of events? Ensure that supervision is aware of them, especially if it's a repeat or this is something that's happening in a pattern. Ensure that a swatting type event is utilized, that phrase, especially if it's verified, is entered into the incident history and the premise history for that incident, or location, if you actually have the ability to do that. That's a wonderful way to then search later on for those records. One of the challenges that we have with this and many other components of the 911 system is that it's a little bit challenging to track these types of problems because of the lack of good data on them. So it becomes a little bit of an issue for us to actually share with policymakers, with stakeholders, just how often this event happens. So documenting that it happened is a very important tool for us to be able to go ahead and take the steps we need to address them. Finally, I would encourage you to make sure that you obtain as much information as possible from the caller. Make sure that your personnel know that getting phone numbers, getting names, getting all those sorts of things is in the end very beneficial, even if they're reporting false information. The longer time they're on the phone, it gives us time to better ascertain the information that's being provided. If we could have the next slide. But finally, the most important component from a 911 PSAP operations side of things is reflected in those numbers that we saw earlier from New York City. One of the reasons why you saw an 80% drop in the malicious false alarms was that the prosecution became much more frequent for those that had transmitted false alarms. We also saw an increase in, quite frankly, the public scrutiny of those who reported them. And the public was made more aware of the consequences of false alarms and why they were such a dangerous thing to do. That needs to happen on this issue as well, informing the public about the consequences of swatting and encouraging your local lawmakers or state lawmakers to pass very strict laws regarding swatting and generating false alarms is a critical piece and potentially can solve these before the calls are ever made in the process. As many of you are aware, once the call is actually made, we're relatively constricted as far as actions that we can take. So the best measure is to do the things we can ahead of time to actually ensure that the call is never made in the first place. And that gamer or whoever it is that wants to make a false call to 911 to generate this type of response reconsiders the idea that it's an effective thing to do, whether because they've been whether that's been exposed in media, the negative effects, or whether they've seen someone else that has done it serve jail time and potentially be fined or other punishments. Whatever that package of issues is, or package of solutions is, the legal side of it, the enforcement side of it, is definitely a critical piece. And with that, what I'd like to do is introduce Mark Fletcher of Avaya. As Lori said, a true leader in the 911 profession and a recent winner of Nina's President's Award for his efforts on Carey's Law. Mark?
Thanks very much, Chris. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be presenting on a webinar to a great group of people that are out there. Thanks to Lori for making this all possible. I want to talk about the mechanics behind swatting. It's really important to understand your enemy. if you're going to fight them effectively. You got to understand, you got to be able to get into their mind and think the way they think. So we're going to teach you some of the mechanics behind swatting, not too much to where we're getting giving the keys to the castle out there, but we're getting you some of the basics that so you can better prepare yourselves to fight this problem. You can go to the next slide, please. Swatting and social engineering are two very different things that are quite often brought together. What I call swatting is an actual attack on the 911 network. It means you're getting a call on 911 trunks with a spoofed Annie. Someone's tricked the system. Now, while it is absolutely possible to do that, it's really not feasible without having some complex equipment. And while it is very possible to do this, it's also very, very difficult to do a true attack on 911 from a remote service area. Now, that's an interesting point right there. If you are getting a call, that is a SWAT call, and it's coming on a 911 trunk, I'd put a paycheck down that that person is somewhere within the service area of your 911 tandem. Because to get in from a remote area, possible, but not real easy. The reality check here, folks, is these are difficult to identify, and they are very difficult to prevent, and that's what the problem is. Fortunately, this mechanism is not our biggest problem today. These, from what I can tell, account for a very, very small percentage of the actual swatting attempts. Most of the swatting that occurs today is happening using social engineering. You'll get calls on administrative lines for a major event. And as Chris said before, someone will call in, oh my God, there's a 20-car accident on Route 80. And that's the only call you've gotten in. Heck, I was a dispatcher back in 1980 before cell phones even existed, and certainly before 911 was deployed. We still got multiple calls on the big incidents. So if you're getting one call on a major incident, that right there is the biggest red flag that you can see. If you're getting that call on the administrative line, don't just react to that. Sure, we've got to treat everything as being real, but think about it. I've got a major incident coming in on an admin line. Somebody stopped to look up the 7 or 10-digit phone number of your police department and is calling you for a major incident that they're just reacting to instead of dialing 911. Again, red flag doesn't make sense. When calls come in on your administrative lines, they can typically have caller ID. Your phone systems can supply that to you. Look for blocked numbers. Look for all zeros. Look for a familiar number or your own number. Again, key indicators of somebody trying to hide their identity. So the reality check here is if these can be identified and minimized through awareness programs and even government-sponsored security hackathons, we can really make a lot of progress to putting this menace to an end. And that's what we're trying to do here today, educate you on the tactics so you can spot them easier. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We talked about social engineering being a huge mechanism for swatting. The main reason behind this is because with the technology that's commonly available today, I can gain what I call an unintentional validation of identity. And here's how it works. A swatter is going to create a false identity via one of the various mechanisms of spoofing your caller ID. Now, to the voice over IP provider, you're an unverified endpoint. But their job is to pass you into the PSTN, public switch telephone network carrier, and that's where you become just an unknown identity. So you've escalated yourself from fake to just unknown, just by being handed off to the carrier network. The carrier network is going to hand you off to the local exchange carrier or the CLEC. And again, unless there's a reason for them not to, they're going to hand you off and you're going to be assumed as a validated call. At that point, your identity has just been escalated to a good ID. Whatever was being shown is assumed to be real. Now I'm basically in the local telephone company's network. I've dialed a 10-digit number. That lives at the police department. Great. They deliver that call to the police department, and it arrives there with caller ID, with caller name, on your admin line. But now is where the social engineering tactics start. And they start to attack the weakest link in the entire chain, and that's the human element. They start prying on your emotions. They start telling you wild stories. They've done all their homework, and they've got a great storyline behind them. What are you doing? You're responding just like you would to the other 1,000 phone calls you got during the shift. And the biggest thing here, there's been no breach of security in the 911 network. There's no indicator. So you've got a call that's crying out for help. You're doing your job, and that's how all of a sudden you find out you've been swatted. Go to the next slide. Spoofing the 911 network is a little more difficult, but absolutely not impossible. I actually used to demonstrate this all the time, but then I stopped demonstrating it because people would come up and try to find out how easy it was and what I was really doing. It all starts out with the void swatter hiding their identity. And they've gone through this escalation of identity from fake to unknown to good. But what they do is they come in and attack the actual 911 tandem network, the selective router. And this is why swatting really needs to be localized. Although I can get at a remote 911 tandem, if I've gotten a lot of information ahead of time and really have pulled the networks apart, there are ways I can get to those tandems. Not very easy, though. But if I am local, I can get to those local interfaces. They're exposed to the public. That's how the phone company, the wireless carriers, that's how everybody gets to them. So they're out there hanging in the wind. So if the swatter can reach them, that's their attack point. Now I can enter the 911 tandem with a spoofed caller ID. I look completely legitimate. The 911 tandem does its job. Oh, I've got a call from Mark Fletcher at 555-7254. That needs to go to Ringwood Police Department, and they hand the call off on the camera trunks. The PSAP gets the call coming in on a 911 trunk. They've got no idea or any indication that there's no validity behind this. You do your anti-alley dip. Oh, it's Fletcher. Yeah, we know where that is. Oh, okay. He just murdered his home family. Let's call out the helicopters and the SWAT teams. Before you know it, I've got a bunch of guys walking up my driveway with shotguns. Fortunately, because this is so difficult, this is not our biggest problem, but it can be. You need to protect the information that you've got in your networks, because this right here, this attack point, is the front door, and you've got to make sure that you do your part to keep it locked. There's a big hackers convention in Las Vegas, and what happened this year was some doctors were there, and they had a topic on swatting and how it works, and everybody got all nervous, and I think Trey Fogarty went out there, a bunch of people from 911. The parking lot, from what I heard, was full of black Caprices with Crown Vics with all dark windows. So I'm sure there was a lot of three-letter agencies in there as well. But what the doctors were talking about were they were monitoring 911 calls, doing some research on getting people to the hospital and understanding what the ailment was. So they were listening to 911 calls. Now, they inadvertently heard on the recordings the inbound carrier tones coming in, the MF tones. You've all heard 911 recordings. When you transfer a call, again, the tones used to transfer that call in the network were on the recordings. And what they found out was, being hackers, white hat hackers themselves, what the heck is that stuff? Hey, let's decode that. Once they decoded it, they realized what it was. What you inadvertently gave them were keys to the network. It was very simple to figure out the format. It was very simple to figure out the codes. So what came out of that was a Nino paper that said, hey, when you're doing recordings, make sure that you redact the call delivery and call transfer tones. Because if you release that to the media, you're giving the hackers the roadmap to start mapping out your network. Circuit IDs, account information. My God, you have got to protect that to the highest level. Even technicians, if they're in there working on your stuff, unless they need that information, they don't have access to it. Treat your network and your configuration like keys to your house. Strictly need to know access. Because in the hands of a SWATter, they can map out your entire network, plan an attack, and that's where this is going to become a big problem. And I'll tell you flat out, if this becomes a problem, we're going to be having a bad day, because there's not a lot of ways without a lot of work on the VoIP providers and the PSTN carriers to identify potential swatting attacks coming in. Next slide, please. As we said, it's the social engineering attempts. Hi, is your refrigerator running? Well, you better go catch it. Okay, that was funny when I was a kid, but now it's a little bit more evil. Look for the signs. They're very easy to spot when you think about it. Single call events on a major incident. While it's not impossible, it's really unlikely that a SWATter is going to be able to simulate the call volume that's going to be indicative on large-scale accidents, on large-scale incidents. You got a motor vehicle accident up on the highway. My God, if you don't get 20 calls on that, something's wrong, right? As we said, you have to respond. You have to treat everyone as real. But there's nothing wrong with letting patrol know that this meets some criteria that just doesn't seem right. And you know what? Sometimes it might just be a gut feeling. There's nothing wrong with vocalizing that. Be suspect of incidents that don't match your normal call volume or call profiles. We all know that a lot of the calls that come into the center, maybe 30, 40%, half, might be NSI, non-service initiated cell phones. Now, you know you receive an ANI on these devices, but did you know that that ANI, that NSI ANI, is actually a unique identifier on the device? It's not just for that call attempt. So why is that relevant? It's the same NSI ANI, then it's likely the same device. And we'll show you in a little bit on the next slide why that's important. But understanding, if you've got a chronic caller, you're going to get the same NSI ANI coming in. Share this information. Because if I'm going to SWAT you, eventually I'm going to get tired, or you're going to get tired of it, and I'm going to go SWAT somebody else. And if I'm over in the next town and they know that that NSI ANI was just swatting over in this town, well, right away they know they've got a SWATter potentially that they're dealing with. All individual clues leading up to the problem. If you get a real call with a real number, but it just doesn't seem right, well, there's nothing wrong with placing a phone call to that number to see what you get. Do I get a busy signal? Do I get voicemail? Does someone answer while someone else is talking to the original caller? But if you're going to do this, be sure that you use an unlisted number in your agency, an unlisted line, or you use one of the spoofing services that are out there that will hide your phone number. Don't tip off your suspect. Because if they've got call waiting on caller ID, oh, how about that? The Meriden Police Department's calling me in the middle. They know they're swatting, so you've just tipped your hand. Next slide. We said NSI devices do have this fingerprint. So a typical burner phone or, won't have a carrier plan, won't have a SIM card, but they're not completely anonymous. There's an IEMI, International Mobile Equipment Identifier. The last 7 digits of that IEMI are actually used with the digits 911 to make up the ante of an NSI call. Did you know that you can go to any cell phone? And everybody's going to grab their cell phone right now and try this. If you dial *06#, send, it will come back and tell you what the IMEI number is on that phone. Why is that important? Because if I'm getting calls from 911-103-7973, and then for whatever reason, I'm now in custody, or you've got access to my phone, if you dial *06# and 103-7973 are the last 7 of IMEI, guess what? You've got evidence that you've got your swatter. At least you've got the device. That could be critical for prosecution. And that's when you take the little sucker and you hang him out front by the flagpole by his belt loops and say, we got one and we're going to get the rest of them. No, don't do that, good golly. It's simple to display this. Your detectives should know this. They may already know this. Again, education, this is what really helps us fight this problem. You can move to the next slide. NSI phones are a huge problem, and there's a current Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, out with the FCC that's already been commented on. Now, in the past, when people have looked to stop NSI phones from reaching 911, there's been a little bit of an uproar from various communities. The domestic violence folks aren't really happy with it. Few other groups saying, hey, look, we distribute these phones out to people who don't have them. You can't shut 911 off. Sometimes it's the only way they have to reach 911. And while that's true, they don't realize that the huge problem these devices cause, the huge amount of resources and financial dollars that these cause our agencies and the networks, and that if you take that money that you would save by not having to deal with NSI phones and then use that money to fund registered real cell phones for the people that do need them, you'd still be saving money and you'd still stop the NSI problem. Most everybody has responded back. NINA and APCO and all the police agencies have responded back saying NSI phones are too much of a burden. It's getting to the point where they are impacting the real calls. And when that starts happening, now the tides have turned. There is going to be a transition that's proposed. Actually, the only thing they're changing in the language is saying that after 6 months, the requirements of this section will no longer apply to calls from NSI handsets. So nothing is changing. It's just they're saying carriers don't have to pass NSI 6 months afterwards. It's going to take a big campaign for enlightenment on that. Next slide. How do people spoof their numbers? This is the juicy stuff. All the hackers that are watching this are going to go, you didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. That's right, too bad. Spoofing services are openly advertised. Anybody can find them if you just Google spoofing on the internet. The problem is that these are actually used for several valid reasons. I could have doctors that are out on their cell phones. They need to call patients. They need to hide their identity, or else they're going to have their patients calling them directly. They need a way of displaying some other number. It could be a police agency, a law enforcement agency looking to hide their identity or appear to be someone else, aiding them in an investigation. But unfortunately, the product positioning seems to promote the illicit services and purposes as well. One says our service is intended for business professionals within the U.S., including but not limited private investigators, skip tracers, law enforcement, and lawyers, giving them the freedom, and here's where the hackers come in, to choose any number as the caller ID. XYZ company allows you to be whoever you want to be. Well, isn't that just dandy? Next slide, please. There's another company that's out there, one of the more popular ones, that actually displays on their home page. Oh, gee, I covered the name up with the red box. Sorry about that. Display a different number to protect yourself or prank on a friend. Hey, it's easy to use and works on any phone. Plus, if you order right now, I mean, come on. When people go out and start advertising at this level, get spoofing now. They'll never know who it was. I mean, now you're just inviting. Now, they will take the stance with everybody else that we support law enforcement, we will help, we will, do this, we'll do that. Bottom line, they will, and IP trace information can and likely does exist on those networks. But you're going to need probable cause and a search warrant before you're going to obtain it. These companies have all vowed to help law enforcement, but they are being paid by their clients for their services to protect their identity. And they're going to not make it easy for you. They will comply, but you're going to need search warrants. So know that ahead of time and start collecting the information so you can counter this. Next slide, please. Really, it's looking at the breadcrumbs and finding the bad guy. In order to SWAT, you need to get access to the PSTN or a 911 network or the internet. This is accomplished a lot of different ways. I can do it via voice, on the internet, but no matter how I'm getting access into the networks, any way that I do this can leave telltale breadcrumbs as evidence. But you're not going to find it unless you look for it and know what you're looking for. You need to be using what I call data forensics, and this is where your investigators need to build up on a brand new skill set. Network IP tracing will show me exactly what I need and where I need to go, but just like fingerprints, I can't take that information, put it into the NCIC computer down in Quantico and have it spit out, that's this guy. You need to have a suspect and then look for a match. And this is where the trace evidence needs to be collected and it needs to be shared with other agencies. You might have one swatting attempt where you've collected some information. That might be the critical key piece of info that's got somebody else who's got 20, 30, 40 incidents from the same guy. Your piece could be the one that puts this guy away. So definitely share this information. Absolutely should be done regionally and locally. Probably should be done on a national basis. Locking the door is no longer sufficient. Security comes up every time we talk about next generation 911. Public safety is going to require a whole new education around network security, the tactics, and understand how the bad guys are working the network to their advantage. That's the purpose of a hackathon. It lets the white hat hackers, the good guys, come in. Here's my network. Here's everything that I got. Try and break into me. And then for the people that do get in, you sit down and you analyze it and go, didn't have that door locked. Oops, didn't know about that one. Wow, we need to put a little more security over here. And then before you know it, your network becomes impenetrable. And that's really solving what the problem is. You can go to the next slide, which is question and answers on this.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Mark. We'll start the question and answer portion of this session now. As a reminder, to ask a question, please use the WebEx chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, or press the raise hand button so we can unmute your phone line. And I'm looking so far. I've not seen any questions. Please, if anybody has one. Okay, we got Roberta Fox. She has a question. I'm going to unmute you now, Roberta. You're available to go ahead, Roberta.
Thank you. How is other parts of the world compared to what you folks have shown, like Canada and Europe? And what advice would you give us?
Thanks for joining from the Great White North, Roberta. Good to see you here. I think the problem is not as bad up in Canada. It doesn't appear to be as bad. That's just my personal indication. While this is a problem over in Europe, they're starting to see this. I'm going to have to say that the continental U.S., North America, is probably the worst example that I'm aware of right now that I see. So this is an excellent opportunity for ENA and the folks up in Canada at ENA and APCO as well to start looking at this ahead of time. This is your opportunity to get a jump on the game. Good question. Thanks.
Yeah, and what we'll also do is we'll take advantage of your FCCs further ahead. So we'll try to get the practices moving at the CRTC and Industry Canada, because they're not even looking at it at all. So let's try to be proactive and get it so we don't have the volume that you folks have.
Well, it's because people up in Canada are nice, Roberta. You guys don't SWAT.
Oh, yeah, they do. They do. Just not as much. Thanks.
Thank you, Roberta. If there's any other questions, please raise your hand or send a chat message in. All right, I am not seeing any other questions. We have some other additional resources for swatting. There's a downloadable resource on the 911 Gov website, and there's also an SEC workshop to focus on robocall blocking. Also, this presentation will be available for download once the webinar has been set up and available for viewing on the 911.gov website. Now, thank you again, Chris and Mark. Lori, do you have any closing remarks?
I do not, but thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Mark. It was really great, really valuable information. I really appreciate it.
This concludes today's webinar. We appreciate everyone's participation. An archived version of today's webinar will be available on 911.gov soon. The next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, October 13th at 12 noon Eastern Time. We hope you will be able to join us. Thank you and have a great day.